Welcome, everyone. We'll wait a couple of minutes for people to join. Thanks for coming. People are still joining. We'll start in just a minute or two. My name is Kate Baker. I'm Dean of the Harris School, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our second Perspectives Public Lecture Series. This is an initiative of our Diversity and Inclusion Office, and I'm so grateful to Michelle Horace for having organized this and for serving as our moderator. I'm delighted to welcome Anjali Adukia to be our speaker. Our series focuses this year on education, which is such an important topic for thinking about intergenerational mobility, closing gaps, promoting inclusion in our economy of the widest range of people. And diversity and inclusion is central to everything that we do at the Harris School of Public Policy. Welcoming voices, diverse perspectives, diverse lived experiences. That's not only the right thing to do everywhere, but it's crucial to making good public policy, to understanding the needs of a diverse population, to understanding the barriers to access to so many important things, and nothing more important than education, except maybe health, which is my area. But this is a great opportunity to bring together both academic researchers and practitioners to better understand how we learn what works, how we address the crucial problems in our society, and how we move that into practice to actually change the way that things are done in the world. And this quarterly perspective series is a great example of all of those perspectives come together. The first speaker in our series was Janice Jackson, who's made access, diversity, inclusion, equity the center point of her leadership of the Chicago Public Schools. That was a wonderful lecture that I encourage you to revisit if you haven't had a chance to see it. But tonight, Professor Adukia will shed light on some of the many factors that go into the educational decision-making that results in people having the fulfilling lifetime careers that they could versus not having access and having barriers to achieving their educational objectives. Those things go well beyond the education sector. People's housing, their food security, their access to latrines, all of these things affect their ability to get the education that they need. And Anjali has studied this across many different settings, including India and the US, thinking about how things like the books that people read, whether they are stereotyped in different ways, affect their educational attainment, thinking about the effects of transportation infrastructure on access to education, and then better understanding how those early investments affect people's lifetime trajectories. So I'm really excited for tonight's series, and I know that you're going to enjoy it very much as well. Without further introduction, I'd like to turn the microphone over to one of our Harris students, Geet Chavla, who is going to introduce our speakers, Anjali and Michelle Horace. So thank you all so much for coming and enjoy tonight's lecture.
Thanks very much, Dean Baker, for kicking us off in this excellent initiative. And it's my absolute pleasure to be here. I would like to introduce our panelists today. Professor Anjali Adukia is an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy and the college. In her work, she's interested in understanding how to reduce inequalities such that children from historically disadvantaged backgrounds have equal opportunities to fully develop their potential. Her research is focused on understanding factors that motivate and shape behavior, preferences, attitudes, and educational decision-making with a particular focus on early life influences. She examines how the provision of basic needs such as safety, health, justice, and representation can increase school participation and improve child outcomes in developing contexts. Professor Adukia completed her doctoral degree at the Harvard University Graduate School of Education with an academic focus on the economics of education. Her work has been funded from organizations such as the William T. Grant Foundation, the National Academy of Education, and the Spencer Foundation. Her dissertation won awards from the Association of Public Policy Analysis and Management, Association for Education, Finance and Policy, and the Comparative and International Education Society. Professor Adukia received recognition for her teaching from the University of Chicago Feminist Forum. She completed her Master's of Education degrees in International Education and Policy and Higher Education from Harvard University and her Bachelor of Science degree in Molecular and Integrative Physiology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She is a faculty research fellow of the National Bureau of Economic Research and a faculty affiliate of the University of Chicago Education Lab and Crime Lab. She was formerly a board member of the Young Nonprofit Professional Network in the Bay Area. She continues to work with non-governmental organizations internationally, such as the UNICEF and Madhav Sadhana in Gujarat, India. Professor Adukia, we welcome you. We also have Michelle, who's the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at Harris Public Policy. Michelle comes to Harris with 20 years of experience in urban policy and development. With an extensive career working for regional and national nonprofits, her depth and breadth of knowledge span across many sectors, including community development, urban education, and healthcare. Her work in these spaces has allowed her to deepen her commitment to diversity and inclusion while working towards equitable solutions for people and communities in greatest needs. At Harris, Michelle is responsible for launching new diversity and inclusion programs and initiatives, managing existing programs, and working directly with Harris student organizations. Michelle has been a practitioner, a researcher, and an instructor. She's also a PhD candidate in policy studies in urban education at the University of Illinois at Chicago, currently conducting research that looks deeply at the intersection of urban and education policy in the city of Chicago. She's taught several policy courses, and she's managed service learning and AmeriCorps programs. Michelle has an MA in Urban Planning and Policy Development from Rutgers University, an MAd in Education Policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and a BA in Economics from Harvard University. It's my absolute pleasure to have you both today as our speakers, and I will now leave the floor to the two of you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Keith and Dean Baker. And thank you all for having me this evening. It's an absolute pleasure. I'm really excited to share this work with you. And, as Keith mentioned, in my work, I am interested in understanding, how can we reduce inequalities such that we can, really allow children from historically disadvantaged backgrounds, really all children, to have those equal opportunities to fully develop their potential. And, in particular, I'm really interested in understanding the factors that motivate and shape, behavior, preferences, attitudes, and educational decision-making with a particular focus on early life influences, with the idea that they have this outsized influence on the rest of children's lives. And in particular, I focus on the provision of basic needs. And, most of my work before, working in the US was actually based in India. And a lot of times when people think about, education in developing contexts, they say, let's give laptops to every child. And it's, I say, yeah, like laptops, I'm sure kids would love them. But the fact is that their basic needs are not met, right? So if we don't have fundamental needs, if kids don't feel safe, if they don't have basic health, then it's going to be much harder to focus on other, needs that they may have. But, not just issues around safety and health, but, then I started working on issues related to justice and this notion that, again, if you don't think that schools or the world, thinks of you as a full human being, right? If you don't feel like you belong, if you don't feel like you're trusted, then that makes it really hard to fully participate. And then, finally, I'm really interested in this notion of representation, because again, if you don't see yourself and if you don't see others, but really, if you don't see yourself, like it really shape what you believe your own potential is, and then, as I said, if you don't see others, then it really shapes your belief about, others' potential and, what, can really shape your own subconscious defaults. And so I'm super, super excited today to share with you some new work on representation in children's books. This is the first time, publicly presenting it, and it's joint work with some amazing collaborators, Alex Ebley from Columbia University, our very own PhD student, Emily Harrison, who is at Harris, and Hakazumwami Barali Renesha and Dora Sass from the University of Chicago's Research Computing Center. Each of these collaborators, plus our larger research team, are really amazing. And, I feel very, very lucky to be working with them. And, I just want to note that, this research has been generously supported by BFI, CDAC, and the Institute of Educational Sciences, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education. And, the opinions that are expressed are of those of the authors and do not represent views of the Institute or the U.S. Department of Education. So, there's this notion that, you can't be what you can't see, right? And that children's beliefs are shaped by the stimuli to which they're exposed, such as through their parents, their peers, their teachers, but books themselves can also be, really important influence. There's this saying, if knowledge is power, then those that control it are particularly mighty. And the process of education itself, and thus all of the materials associated with it, the curriculum, the books, necessarily and by design transmit not only the sociocultural values of society, but whose space it is. And representation can matter. Implicit messages contribute to how children view the potential of themselves and others, thus really forming subconscious defaults based on the presence and absence of identity, such as gender or race. But often, gender and race are treated as these mutually exclusive categories of experience and analysis. So, for example, if when you're talking about representation of women, you're really limiting the discourse and your mental frame to white women. Or if you're talking about people of color, then really you're talking about men. And so, it's important that we really account for this intersectionality, right? That we account for not just these multiple identities, but how these multiple identities intersect with experiences of exclusion and subordination. And, there have been these calls for increased representation over time, but we don't know, has it really happened? But how do you know if it's happened, right? How do you actually measure systematically representation? And a lot of traditional content analysis, literally requires, taking a book and looking page by page by page. And, you get very in-depth information, but it is extremely expensive to really do a large sample of books. And so, what we want to do is we actually use machine learning, right? And it's certainly not perfect when you try to use these tools of artificial intelligence, because, artificial intelligence is only human. It's trained by humans. And so it reflects the biases that humans carry. But what it does, so does traditional content analysis for that matter. And it also allows for estimates over a large set of corpora, right? You can look at millions of pages in a very short period of time relative to dozens, which may take a lot longer. Now, school libraries themselves, right, they are major purveyors of sanctioned children's content. And so what we are going to be looking at are award-winning books. And so these are books actually that are authors and illustrators of books that have received awards from the Association for Library Service to Children. And so the reason we've chosen these books is because they're likely to appear in school libraries and classrooms. They're likely to appear on people's bookshelves. And so exposure is likely to be very high. And what we want to ask and understand is, first of all, how do you measure representation systematically? There are a set of tools related to text analysis that have been much more developed and used over time. But, we also want to use the images. And so we apply and develop various computer vision and image analysis techniques to be able to systematically take information from the images on pages and actually transform it into data. We want to know who is represented in these books. So we look at gender identity and, in terms of the actual measures, we're starting with whether, someone's female presenting or male presenting, and it's unfortunately, this is a big limitation, right? That this is limited to the binarization of gender, right? And it's super important that we take into account non-binary and genderqueer identities and gender fluidity. And so that represents an important area for future work. we also want to look at racial constructs and, racial constructs themselves, right? Like, what is race? It's, a very ill-defined concept. And so we look at it in three ways. There's the putative racial identity, your birthplace, the place that you were born, and skin color. So if you think about racism and isolationism and colorism, these are some of the isms that often can be exacerbated by lack of representation. And we also look at age, so whether there are children represented or adults represented. And then we ask about so who is doing the representing, by whom? And so because we have these different awards that are given for different purposes, we can try to look and see whether different collections of books, differentially represent children or different identities. And so, I will tell you a little bit about the data, briefly about the methods that we're using, share some of the initial results, and summarize, but we want to leave it open for whatever questions people have at the end as well. So, this is the set of children's book awards that we are drawing from. The oldest two book awards in the US are the Newbery Medal in Honors and the Caldecott Medal in Honors. And these are books that are given, for high literary value, right? They're not supposed to be about what's popular, and they're supposed to be for all children. They're not actually targeting any particular set of identities. And so we lump these together as like a mainstream collection. And then there's this other set of books that are actually given specifically to highlight particular identities. The Amelia Bloomer book awards, they're supposed to highlight women or, feminist perspectives. The Coretta Scott King book awards, they highlight the African-American experience, and whatnot. And so all of these other ones that actually highlight particular identity, we lump into a bigger group called diversity books, or the diversity collection. And then we actually look at them in smaller subsets of, the collection of books that are supposed to highlight people of color, or that highlight the African-American experience, or, highlight people with disabilities, or females, or LGBTQ. And all of these are books that, as we said, or as I said, we got from the American Library Association. And you can see that the mainstream books go back the furthest. They go back to 1920, and the rest of the books don't really enter the sample until 1970, just to give you a sense about kind of what our sample size is. And so how is it that we are measuring gender identity, racial constructs, and age? So we want to leverage machines, and we're going to use the existing and established tools to convert the text into data, through natural language processing. And then to convert images into data, we use these new computer vision tools, and then we actually develop some new ones to be able to provide measures of representation on these three fronts. And as I said before, it's really important to note that the challenges are that, the notion of gender is binarized, it's limited, it doesn't capture gender fluidity or non-binary identities. And, race as a construct is, very subjective, it's multifaceted, and putative at best. So just to kind of briefly walk you through what the pipeline looks like from, converting the original pages of a book into data, like text data. So first you apply, optical character recognition, which actually gives the text containing all detected words. You do some basic text cleaning to remove page numbers, table of contents, like any kind of front and end matter. And then you can actually get just what are called token counts or word counts, and we can pull out words related to gender, such as like she or her or queen, or boy. You can get words related to race. And so this could be things like African or race or ethnicity, or nationality for that matter. And it could be Canadian, it could be Kenyan, it could be Indian. And then we actually have words related to colors. So black, white, blue. And the books, the words that you're seeing highlighted are ones that actually appear in this particular example. And then separately, and so these give us, measures of gender and then racial constructs, right? Just as a very kind of rudimentary, let's just count the words approach. Another way is actually to look at the character names themselves. And so, we can pull out the first names that are present. So if there's just, a character mentioned, in this case, it's Annie, then we can use the Social Security Administration database to predict whether or not this name is, female or male. Again, there's a lot of imperfections in that, but, surprisingly, it's actually quite predictive. And that gives us a measure of the gender. And we can also pull out the famous characters, right? So with Rosa Parks, there's a database called Pantheon, which is connected to, which actually scraped Wikipedia. And so that has information about like gender and birthplace. And so, then we get gender and birthplace. And then we actually had a team that actually manually labeled race to give us the race of these famous characters. Now for images, right? So you start with the original book, and then we actually want to detect the face. And so the way that the algorithm works is that it detects the face. We get the face, the cropped face. We run it through an algorithm to predict gender and age. And then to actually get, and so, it can actually also give us race. The problem with that is a lot of the race predictions are very biased and don't actually give very accurate outcomes. And so that's why we haven't looked at it at this point. So instead we actually look at skin color, but to do that, right, we don't want to just get all the colors here, but somehow we need to train the computer to actually be able to isolate the skin. So we run this, what's called a skin segmentation program. And what it does is it, identifies what's skin and non-skin, and then it keeps what it's identifying as just skin. And then, it draws out what the 5 most predominant colors are. And we can take a weighted average of that. And then we can either look at the distribution of these weighted averages, and we call this tint, or we can actually, look at it again across the distribution and break it into thirds and say, okay, the first third, is considered to be darker skin tones. The middle third is medium skin tones, and then the right third is like lighter skin tones. And there are obviously various problems that come about with all of this. Whether the skin doesn't get segmented properly, if you don't detect faces, the actual classifications about whether someone is presenting as a female or male or child or adult. And so we try to take these into consideration by, calculating potential confidence intervals, around whatever estimates we get. And so the final measures, just to remind you, for gender identity, for text, we have pronoun counts. We have other gendered word counts, such as, mother, boy, king, the gender of famous figures and the predicted gender of first names. On the image side, we have the predicted gender of faces, and that's like, okay, if someone is labeled as being above 50%, female or male, then they get assigned that particular gender. But then we also have the probability of genders, which gives a more continuous measure. For racial constructs, we have those ethnicity or race word counts. We have word counts of colors, the manually coded race of famous figures, and then the birthplace of famous figures. And then on the image side, we use the skin color of faces. For age, the way that we measure it is in text. So if you think about queen, those are like older females. Or if you think about boy, that's a younger male. And so we use age by gender word counts to provide a measure of age from text. And then we have the predicted age of faces on the image side. So just to get to the results, what we see. So here we're just looking at mainstream versus diversity collection. And the x-axis, so the closer to 0 is the higher percentage of male words that you have on average. And the closer to 100% is the more female words that you have. And so what you see is that the mainstream collection, or books in the mainstream collection, are much more skewed male than diversity books. And if you want to look at it across all collections, you see that this is actually a pretty similar pattern. And really, it's the female collection that is much more likely to be skewed to the right, but even then, not fully, right? But relative to the other collections, which is what you would expect. Now, if you want to look at it just in terms of like the share of female words within collections, again, like on average, no collection except for the female collection ever gets above 50% as being, predominantly female. And, this is another way of looking at it where you look at the ratio of male words to female words, and, everything is above the line, above the 45-degree line, implying that, again, there's more male representation of words relative to female words, except for, the female collection and then one decade of the African-American collection. And then, if you wanted to look at it over time, then you see that, again, none of the collections ever get above 50% in their history, except for the female collection. We only have the female collection for the last decade. If you wanted to break it down by type of word, so that's all types of gendered words. This is looking at just pronouns, just specific word counts, just the gender of famous figures, and just the predicted gender of character first names. And you see the same pattern for all of them, where, the female collection is greater than 50%, but none others actually ever get to 50%. But actually what's interesting is when you look at famous figures and you say, oh, okay, well, what about unique mentions within a book? So even if Rosa Parks is mentioned 4 times within a book, let's count her as one, as an appearance in that book. When you look at it that way, actually, even in the female collection, they don't even get to 1/3 of the characters that are mentioned uniquely as being female. And so that means that 69% of the unique famous figures that are mentioned within the female collection are actually male, which is really quite surprising, right? And if you wanted to see I'll show you later, but, in terms of, on the image side, so, we see that none of the books or none of the collections over time identify on average more than 50% of females, though nearing it, except for the ability collection and the female collection, which are much higher. And, when you plot whether females are seen relative to being in the text, it's interesting that they're more likely to be visualized than actually written about. So there's this notion of like, are they seen more than they're heard? But regardless, you see that, they are represented less than 50% of the time, whether it's in text or an image. Then when we want to think about measuring representation in terms of race and ethnicity, this is just a very rudimentary measure where we try to look at the percent of total words that are these like ethnicity or nationality or race words. And it's really just the collections, like the diversity collection, the people of color collection, and the African-American collection, which get, a bit more representative or has more representation of these words. Another way to potentially look at it is just looking at the mentions of color words, which again is imperfect because you could use the colors for anything, but you do see that the African-American collection and the people of color collection are much more likely to mention the word Black or even white relative to, the word blue or red. And so what we also do is we manually code the race of unique famous people. And, in the mainstream collection, over 90% are people who are white. The African-American collection gets, more representation of people who are Black, but still substantial representation of people who are white. And when you break this down by gender, you see that they're all overwhelmingly white males, followed generally closely by white females, except for the African-American collection, where Black males are the second most represented. And, when you look at, other groups, whether it's people who are Asian, Latinx, Indigenous, multiracial, the numbers are extremely small. And, generally speaking, even within, these different racial groups, the males tend to have more representation than females. In terms of the actual appearances of famous people, like the people themselves, this is just pulling out from the mainstream and diversity corpora. You can see like the top 10 names are all male, except Rosa Parks in the diversity collection, and in the mainstream collection, they're all white. So this is just, how many mentions they have and how many books they uniquely appear in. And then we actually look at like the birthplace of famous figures. And so, again, you think about like from a child's perspective, if you only are ever exposed to people from where you grew up, right, then it doesn't give you a sense of who else like is out there, and it can actually contribute to these notions of nationalism or isolationism over time. And so actually, if you look at the mainstream, the representation of famous figures from different birthplaces in the mainstream collection, you see that they're primarily, in the US, really kind of like even the eastern side of the US and Europe. Whereas in the diversity collection, you actually see much more representation around the world. But even then, when there is more representation, it generally is male figures who are in other parts of the world. A little bit for the diversity collection for females, but still substantially more males. And then what we do is we actually look at face colors over time. And what you see here is every single dot represents a different face in the collections in those books. And often these are, you actually can't, like really what you would want to be able to see is 3D, because a lot of these are actually piled up on top of each other. And, they're ordered in terms of tint. So, this side would be darker skin tones, and this side is lighter skin tones. And so this is 1920 all the way to 2010. And, what's important to note, again, these are children's books, and actually children's books are a really nice kind of test case for especially developing like image analysis tools, because, they have illustrations and photographs, and, a lot of the face detection models that are out there are actually all trained on photographs. So we actually had to train a model on illustrations in particular. They have so many different colors. They have everything from like, what you would expect to be like human skin colors, and the way that that's defined in color theory is, there's like R is greater than G is greater than B, but that's going to be most likely in photographs. And so you want to separate that from, the black and white photos. And as you see, like early on, there were a lot more black and white photos than later on, certainly in the mainstream, though, increasingly in the people of color and diversity collection. And then there's a third bucket of they're polychromatic. So they are in color, but they're, blue or they're green. And, they're not kind of your typical human skin colors. Now, of course, like, when people are illustrating, people with different skin tones, you can imagine that there might also be skin colors that are missed in our, categorization of human skin colors, simply because of the paint they use or the colors they chose. Now, if we wanted to look at representation of skin colors over time, so first, again, remember on the left side, this is saying that there are darker skin tones represented, and on the right side, it's lighter skin tones. And so what we see is that the mainstream collection is much more likely to have representation of human skin color, of lighter human skin colors relative to the diversity collection. And if you look over time, you can actually see there's almost like this, racial ambiguation of within the mainstream corpora, where, yes, like they actually are, they're still more like have lighter skin bins or skin tones than darker skin tones, but they really have a lot of medium. Whereas with the diversity collection, you're much more likely to have representation of both medium skin colors and darker skin colors. And you can see this on average playing out where, the mainstream collection is, predominantly this center medium skin tone, followed by the lighter skin tone, but they're pretty equal. And you can think of this as like a butterscotching effect. Whereas in diversity, there is this more representation of medium and darker skin relative to lighter skin. And you actually see this pattern in the other collections as well. Certainly for the collections that highlight people of color, but also the female collection. And this pattern holds even for the monochromatic or the non-human skin color images themselves. Actually, when you look at the distribution of skin color by gender in terms of images, we actually don't see that big of a difference between female and male representation across the skin color distribution. But what's interesting on the age side is actually both for text and for images, there are many more adults than children. So these are, average older female words or male words relative to younger female and male words. The two bars on the right here represent like identified adult faces in images relative to child faces. And so, there are many, many more adults that are presented in these children's books. So again, you think about like, what is my sense of self and who am I seeing and who am I hearing about? But when you look at the distribution of skin colors by age, something that's particularly pernicious is actually, so the gray represents children and the, turquoise-ish represents adults. You see that all of these distributions are shifted lighter, regardless of collection for children. So children are represented as being lighter than adults, which can actually have a lot of detrimental potential consequences. If you think about like, again, if you're representing the ideal child as being a lighter skin tone or these notions of innocence and whatnot, then that can actually form particular notions in people's minds. And so, this is not just an academic exercise, right? There are everyday opportunities to instill more equitable representation. So, as a thought experiment, right? Like if you think about the stories from your childhood, think about the main characters, the storylines, the side characters, think, well, would these be appropriate for both boys and girls? Would you consider getting them as gifts for, another child, regardless of that child's gender? Now, imagine that same set of books and flip the genders of all of the characters portrayed in the books. Would you still say that they are appropriate for both boys and girls? Most books have boys as the heroes, and those books are considered to be equally good for both boys and girls. But when a girl is the protagonist, right, it's more likely to be labeled as a book just for girls than for anyone. If you have the protagonist as someone who uses a wheelchair, people are much more likely to give that to somebody, who uses a wheelchair. If there's a protagonist who identifies as transgender, you may not be as likely to get that for your cisgender child. And, so there's this question of like, why is it that we are likely to, pick the dominant group as saying that can be status quo. But, if there are particular identities that are marginalized, that are highlighted, then it's really for people with those identities who should be getting those particular kinds of books or content. When really, if we really want to think about representation more broadly and shaping how people perceive the world and, those around them, and their potential, then, we need to take a broader conception of what representation can look like. And, we talk about structural racism and sexism and ageism, and, these are structural issues though. But what you see in your books and the curriculum, those are structural. Those aren't things that teachers can easily change or parents can easily change. You work with what you have. And so, a systemic problem requires a systemic solution. There's this question of like, well, what is the optimal level of representation? And that itself is a philosophical question that we, are not addressing in this, right? And, nor is it in the scope of this project, but we can at least measure representation, and hopefully with those measures, or at least try to measure it, we can try to improve upon it. But the fact is, how is it that you measure it if you don't have the tools? And so that's something which in this project, we try to develop these tools. We want to make them available for use. We present these patterns of representation. Hopefully this will also catalyze further research to use these really cool image analysis tools that are out there. And we really want to bridge this gap between the fundamental problem of this, like the learning barrier that's really well documented, that comes from educational materials that don't mirror children, from a broad set of society, but also the lack of tools that are available to educators and publishers and practitioners to really choose books and content that represent children in their full humanity. And, also for researchers, who do want to, analyze content systematically, paired with, traditional content analysis, techniques that are more manual. And actually what I didn't show you today is, we've also manually coded, thousands of images to, mirror what it is that, traditional content analysis researchers would actually normally do. And so anyway, I will stop here and take any questions, but thank you so very much for having me. And I welcome any questions. Thank you.
I could listen to you for another hour talk about this, because this is absolutely fascinating. I have questions, but I also encourage audience members, please feel free to use the Q&A function and send your question our way. So I think my first question is, is there anything that surprised you in this research? Like any of you, like what gave you pause in a way that you weren't expecting?
Well, I think I was first sad. I was very surprised. I guess you could expect that, okay, going back, that there would be a lot of issues in terms of representation. But I expected, at least even in the mainstream, I thought in the last decade, you would see improvements. And actually, if you really look at how skin color, the skin color distribution over time, in the last 2 decades, there's actually this increase of lighter skin tones relative to other skin tones. And I was like, wait, what? Like, I at least would have thought there would have been a continuous upward trajectory, or at least even if it was like slight. I was pretty horrified looking at the distribution of skin colors by age, and this notion that no matter who it is, children are always depicted as lighter. And what does that do? What implicit messages are being sent with that? And it's an empirical question, right? And so everything is speculative, but, you can imagine what those hypotheses would be and what hypotheses should be tested. And, if you really want to test, like what happens if you flip things up for children. And so, I also thought that collections that, highlight particular identities would actually be extremely skewed towards just representing, people from that given identity. And, you still see a lot of whiteness, a lot of maleness. So it's, I guess, you could say, oh, I'm not surprised, but I would have thought there'd be more progress, at least a little bit.
I thought your point at the end about, when you're thinking about gift giving, right? And you're giving a book to a child. I mean, I know as a parent, I actually do think very long and hard. My husband might say I'm putting way too much, emphasis on trying to pick this book, just pick the book. But, and I don't think that I'm alone in that. But what I do think is that people who are trying to make a conscious effort buy that perfect book, they go and they can't find the perfect book, or they don't know like what is everything in the universe we should be thinking of, right? When we go to buy that book purchase. So that was a really interesting point, and it continues to make me think about that. And I don't know how to necessarily advise people on how to buy that perfect book, but I think even being in environments where you have choices, I think has been very limiting. I can go to a bookstore on the south side of Chicago that will give me very different offerings than somewhere in a northwest suburb of Chicago, right?
Yeah. And actually something that we often think about is that, actually like in our toolkit, like we actually have to digitize it and turn things into, like you OCR it to get the text, detect the faces, actually even just detect the images to begin with, right? And actually, like you can imagine publishers using this set of tools. They already have everything digitized. They already know what the images are, right? You run these through an algorithm, and for every single book, you could have like a representation scorecard. And it's not going to be perfect, but at least it gives people some sense of like, okay, well, who is represented, and how. And here we're really just talking about who. And actually, an important point to make is that this is still numeric representation. And it's really important to get past whether people are represented to understand how people are represented, right? So you really want to think, because we don't want to just have tokenism, right? You could say, oh my gosh, there's all women in this. But if they're all being portrayed in just a very limited or narrow like set of occupations or set of actions or ways, there's this Caldecott book called Mei Li, early on. And, it's got a lot of female words in it because the main character is female, but, it ends with her palace is, cleaning the home and, that is her kingdom. And it's like, there's nothing wrong with that. But the fact is, it's still like, and throughout they say, well, girls can't do that and girls can't do this and girls can't do that. And so, the next step in all of this is really kind of thinking about like, how can we then take the tools that we have to understand how people are represented and not just whether.
So, this research is extremely timely. There's a great deal of controversy in the past week or so about children's books that include stereotypes of different ethnicities and the effects that it has on children, whether those stereotypes came from a place of ignorance or actual malice, is still, up for debate. But what do you make of this sort of reckoning of children's literature, and how can your research inform sort of where we go from here?
I mean, I think it's great that it's in the public consciousness, right? And, I think there's an important role for critical thinking, and, no piece of literature is perfect, just like no research paper is perfect, right? Nothing is ever perfect. So it can always be critical, but that doesn't mean that we have to elevate those particular books, right? And so again, but how do we measure this systematically other than some people saying, oh, well, I think this might be problematic, and what does problematic mean? And how do we kind of take some of the subjectivity out of it and just say, okay, well, let's look, at, again, who is represented and how and what is represented. And, you, again, can figure out what that optimal level is or what might be optimal triggers. But I think it's a really important set of discussions that need to happen.
So we have lots of great questions that the participants have been sending us. So let's see, the first one, I imagine at this point that publishers are aware of this issue. Are you finding that they're receptive to improving going forward in response to your research? And have you discussed this with the industry at all?
So, we haven't shared this work yet, because as I said, this is like a kind of the unveiling. We're very excited to share it and get feedback. But we are really excited to actually share it with people in the industry. Certainly early conversations with people who are on the publishing side, people are very well-intentioned. People really do care, at least the people we spoke with. There could be selection as to who we spoke with, but yet people say like, yeah, even in our diversity lists for, XYZ History Month, like they know that like yeah, like these aren't quite right. And yet these books, like that are these award-winning books, they're the ones that people turn to very frequently to say, we're going to highlight this during Women's History Month. We're going to highlight this during Black History Month. We're going to highlight that, if even within that, they're not really representative of, or showcasing the representation you want, then that's really, yeah, that's something that they do want. And so hopefully these tools are something that they can use systematically to be able to kind of assess that and measure that.
Mhm. You mentioned about the systematic nature of this problem. Beyond author biases, what other factors do you think play a role in limiting diversity?
I mean, look, like, we can only reflect what society reflects to us. And so, books themselves are reflections of all of the structural biases that are out there. And, it's kind of like this notion of mirrors and windows. And so, if we can expand what it is that kids are seeing, but it's not just authors, right? Like there's so many influences in kids' lives. It's parents, it's peers, it's teachers, and that's why I really highlight that this shouldn't just be thought of as an academic exercise. There's choices every single day. Like, if you see a dog on the streets, or if even in a book, people often say he. And it's like, well, why? We don't know that that dog is a boy, and yet there's this default to assuming that whoever is there is part of the dominant group. And so, I think a lot of it can start even with just trying to really kind of recognizing okay, well, am I automatically gendering the world, or, automatically assigning, particular identities to entities that otherwise don't necessarily need it. And there's this question of well, why do we focus so much on these identities, right? And why is it often the first conversation as opposed to just being a part of, the larger humanity that somebody inhabits?
So another question. I'm really curious about the progress that you've made on the tools to choose content for children. Like what technique would be applied in the invention and the prospect of this tool?
I'm sorry, can you say that last part again?
Mm-hmm. What technique would be applied in the invention and the prospect of this tool that you, do you want to read through your question again? I'm curious about the progress you've made on the tools to choose content for children.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not that we're trying to create it's not that we're creating tools that directly choose content. We're trying to create tools that can help measure representation in content such that people can use those measurements to make informed choices. And, on the tech side of things, a lot of these methods have been developed and are established. And so part of that is, translating them from the computer science world. There are, some in the social science world who have actually started to adapt them to this context. But actually on the side of image analysis, there is a lot more work to be done. I mean, it feels like, every other week there's a new paper that we're like, oh, we should look at that. And oh, somebody else is trying to, create a model to help, identify illustrations or identify, XYZ attributes. And so, we've, been able to train a model on the face detection side to help detect illustrations, which actually improved over the existing models where they're actually improved our face detection by 100 times. So we actually got 100 times more faces. And, on the gender and age classification, again, we had to train that on actually 7,000 images that we had to manually code to, again, bring in illustrations because, people might be represented in different ways. And, there wasn't a way ex ante for us to think about well, how do we assess skin color? And so, we thought, okay, well, how would you do it? And so one way is through this process of isolating the skin, thinking about like what are the different clusters of like the predominant skin colors and creating a weighted average. We're currently developing some like deep learning methods, using like autoencoders, and that way you don't even have to segment the skin. You go straight from the detected face to, actually identifying it. But, actually what we want to do is go beyond faces. We want to think about characters and actions and emotions. And like, again, that really tells you a lot more about like, what is the character doing? How are they being represented?
If there are several more questions, and we will take these questions back, and we can definitely continue to address these. But I know that we are running close up to time, and I wanted to get a couple of more questions out before we have to wrap up. And one is, and this isn't specific to this research, I think it's all of your research and your interest in sort of what drives you in the research that you do. You focus a lot on, these impediments to learning, and you look at everything that happens outside, of the classroom that serve as these barriers for kids in learning. And I know that sometimes when we are thinking about these, there's just so many barriers, and we often don't know sort of where to start, right? Do we deal with issues of healthcare? Do we deal with issues of housing? Do we deal with issues of safety? Like where do we start? It's, in some ways it's sort of this pin the tail on the donkey, and you've got to stop somewhere. But I'm interested in hearing your thoughts, and for other people who sort of look at this intersectionality around this particular issue, because it cuts across so many different other policy issues.
So, I actually think you have to start somewhere, right? And the nice thing is that there are so many people in the world with such differing interests and different passions that actually, like, if people really kind of, found their voice, found their truth, right? Like that what gets them out of bed in the morning? What keeps them up at night? Like what ignites their fires? It might be housing. It might be, issues of justice. It might be issues around education or representation. But it should be what you care about. And if everybody really did that and really thought, okay, I'm going to look at what I not only really care about, if it's really are passionate about, it's going to be much more likely that you're actually going to be able to make a difference, and a meaningful difference, because you're going to think about that question in a way that nobody else has thought about it, because it's coming from a place within. You're drawing from that deep truth and knowledge from within you. And so, I think this is where like us working together and not just kind of having like these silos in terms of policy, but having policy coherence across, different dimensions really can make a difference, and actually be really powerful to help shift paradigms and help us address questions in more fundamental ways. So I don't think what's nice is it's not just one person that's addressing this. Like every person does have to start somewhere, and I think the best place to start is like what's within.
That's really good advice, because otherwise, the problem is so big to tackle that it's easy to not tackle it at all. And I think, sadly, we are running up against time. And so I think we have time for one more question, which I know this popped up in the Q&A in some form as well. What's next in this study? And then what next do you want to study?
There are so many questions, and I feel so lucky that, part of my job is to think about like, how do we articulate the wonder that we see in the world, right? And so, as I mentioned, for this study, there's a lot of different potential directions that we want to take, in part, and really like, first and foremost, thinking about how people are represented and what are, meaningful, automated, machine-led types of tools that we can either apply or develop to, understand like, how people are depicted, to again, get beyond this notion of just tokenism or just numbers. So like within this and otherwise, there's just so many questions that I'm excited to pursue, right? And there's, I'm doing some other work related to restorative justice in schools. And again, this notion of like, do kids feel that they are, that they belong, that they feel a full part of that community. Are they trusted? Do they feel like a whole person? And, what are ways that school districts can interact with behavior and, both on the teacher and the student side. So, there are many, we could talk for a long time about questions that I'm excited about. I tell everybody, especially people who are interested in research, but actually really anything, is just keep a journal of the questions and the things that excite you and that ignite you. And, over time, you'll actually start to see, and, it could just be something you heard, or, oh, there was a New York Times article you're really excited about, or there was a paper that was assigned in class or that came out that actually didn't feel like a job to read, right? It felt like, oh, this is exciting. I want to hear this, or that's a talk that I really want to hear. Keep track of those things, and you'll see over time themes really emerge as to like what your own bubble is. Like, going back to your question of like where to start, that will help kind of put bounds on like, okay, well, this is actually, again, not a job. This is exciting and this is life. And so, yeah.
And when will your research be available for public consumption?
So this paper, we hope, will be available in the next month or so. So yeah. And
Okay,
there's going to be many projects to come from this. So
wonderful. Well, I can't thank you enough for spending your dinner hour, everybody's dinner hour, with us this evening. You have been an amazing and a perfect addition to this perspective series that we launched this year. And I'm so honored to be able to bring your work to this discussion and this platform, so that, especially remotely, I mean, there's great advantages to being remote, because, one of our questions that came in was from someone who said good morning. So we know that they are not a domestic student. They're not here in the US right now. So I just want to thank you. Your work is timely, and it is extremely important, and it's refreshing, it's enlightening, it's inspiring. So thank you very, very much on behalf of all of us at Harris and the Harris community. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a privilege and an honor. It was really, really lovely to talk with you all this evening. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much. Have a good night.
Good night.